rip apart the lives of millions. As the heated debate escalates, Crockett exposes the brutal truth behind the $290 billion cost of Alzheimer's care, while revealing the heartbreaking sacrifices of unpaid family caregivers who have been left to shoulder the burden alone. With every word, she demands not just to protect, but to radically expand research and support, risking everything to change the course of history. Will Crockett's unwavering emotional appeal break through, or will Greene's cold, calculated policy seal the fate of countless families? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber of the House hearing room stood silent and heavy, lined with dark oak panels and lit by steady, clinical overhead lights. In front of each lawmaker, red microphone lights glowed, live, recording, and ready. At the center hung a formal placard, House Committee on Public Health and Aging Budgets. Cameras panned slowly across the dais, capturing tense expressions and rigid postures. Behind them, rows of gallery seats were filled with elderly citizens and grieving families. Many held framed photos, fathers in uniform, mothers smiling before illness stole their minds. Their faces were still, but their eyes screamed, "Don't let them erase us." The press box whispered like a hive. Reporters leaned close, scribbling notes and murmuring updates. "Greene's about to call for a 60% cut to Alzheimer's funding," one voice said, low but sharp. That number, 60%, hung in the air like a threat. A woman in the front row clutched her late husband's portrait tighter, knuckles white. Jasmine Crockett sat near the edge of the panel, motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. Around her, the hearing felt less like a policy session and more like the quiet before a brutal verdict. And then, just as the silence threatened to crack under its own pressure, she rose. Marjorie Taylor Greene stood with a mechanical calm, like a blade drawn from its sheath. The gray of her blazer matched the steel in her gaze, cold, smooth, and calculated. No glance toward the audience, no flicker of empathy. Her hand gripped a dense stack of briefing papers, crisp edges sharp under her manicured fingers. Her heels clicked once against the marble floor as she stepped forward, steady, unapologetic. Then she spoke, flat, deliberate, without crescendo or softness, her voice more function than feeling. "I am not here to be kind," she began, each syllable slicing through the air like a verdict. "I am here to save the budget." The words fell with chilling precision, detonating not with volume, but with intent. Behind her, someone in the gallery inhaled audibly. A photograph shifted in a trembling hand. She didn't flinch. Her face remained utterly still, as though sculpted from concrete. "Alzheimer's patients no longer contribute to our economy," she said next without blinking. "They require care, not investment. Our nation cannot afford sentimentality masquerading as fiscal policy." It was the kind of statement that doesn't echo. It detonates. No stammer, no hesitation. Just the arithmetic of utility wrapped in the indifference of power. She glanced down at her notes once, not to find her place, but to signal she didn't care what reaction followed. "If we want to build a future," she said, "we must fund the living engines of productivity, not preserve what can no longer function." The room chilled further, as if her very presence had lowered the temperature. On the Democratic bench, a few lawmakers shifted uncomfortably, furrowed brows, clenched jaws, but none interrupted. Whether it was caution, strategy, or pure disbelief, they said nothing. Greene had claimed the microphone and wrapped the hearing in silence, not by raising her voice, but by lowering the value of human life to a budget line. She stood in full command of the moment, but behind her, unseen by her, something was beginning to rise. Jasmine Crockett, still silent, had not blinked once. The silence that followed wasn't stillness, it was suffocation. From the second Greene's final sentence landed, the air inside the hearing room turned into glass, clear, rigid, and on the edge of shattering. In the second row, a woman in her 70s, wrapped in a faded lavender shawl, lifted a hand to her mouth. Her eyes welled instantly, and despite her efforts, the sob broke free. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, helpless, real. Beside her, a younger man, perhaps her son, reached over and gently gripped her trembling hand. anchoring her in place as if afraid she might break entirely. The camera caught it in perfect clarity. Her tears, the whiteness of her knuckles, the blurred edge of a photograph folded in her lap. And then like a slow-turning tide, the lens drifted across the gallery, faces stiff with rage, a jaw clenched so hard it trembled, an elderly veteran narrowing his eyes behind bifocals, eyes wide, lips pressed into silence. No one yelled. No one needed to. The room didn't erupt. It simmered. Then the camera swung, not with drama, but with intention. It locked onto Jasmine Crockett like a sniper scope. She sat motionless, shoulders squared, posture composed, but tension radiated from every inch of her body. Her right hand held a pen, its metal tip hovering just above yellow legal paper, a half-formed word frozen mid-thought. Her lips were sealed in a tight line, unmoving, unreadable. But the camera caught it, a single tremor in her fingers. Not from fear, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of what she had just witnessed. The kind of injustice that demands silence before fire. And in that flicker of a hand, in that breath she did not take, something shifted, not just in her, but in the room. The crowd didn't see it yet. Greene didn't feel it yet. But the reckoning had already begun. The tremor in her hand had passed, but what remained was something far more controlled, far more dangerous. It was not a reaction. It was a decision. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat in a motion so slow, so precise, that it stole the attention from every corner of the room without a single word. Her chair made the faintest groan against the marble floor, a subtle crack in the oppressive silence. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't adjust her blazer. Her eyes were already fixed, trained like a laser on Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she did not blink. There was no flourish, no theatrics, only stillness, carved with intent. A force began to gather behind her presence, not loud but inevitable. She stood not just to speak, but to defend. Not herself, not her party, but something far older, far more sacred, memory and the right to be remembered. When she spoke, her voice came low, measured, every syllable planted like a stake in the ground. My mother, she began, her gaze unbroken, was a frontline nurse for 30 years. She didn't say it to boast. She said it as if it were a sworn fact that had been ignored too long. She held dying children in her arms. She worked double shifts through hurricanes and flu seasons. She stitched open wounds and caught newborns in emergency rooms where the air smelled like rust and fear. Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't falter. And today, she can't remember my father's name. The words didn't need embellishment. They didn't echo. They punched. Greene didn't move. Behind Crockett, the gallery leaned forward in absolute silence, as if 1 inch closer might protect them from the violence of forgetting. Crockett turned slowly from Greene to the room itself, to the grieving and the forgotten, and the families who had come here not for politics, but for acknowledgement. Her voice deepened, not in anger but in conviction. She doesn't remember who she saved. She doesn't remember the faces. But that doesn't mean we get to forget her. She paused, holding the silence like a blade to the throat of the moment. She deserves respect, not because of what she can give us now, but because of who she already gave us then. No one moved. No one exhaled. Crockett stood like a pillar in the storm, unshaken, unafraid. For a single breathless moment, time inside the chamber froze. And in that moment, it was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning. As Crockett's words hung in the air, thick with gravity, Greene made her move. A quick, sharp shift that sliced through the tension like a blade. Without hesitation, she reached for her microphone, her fingers nimble but deliberate. With a sharp twist, she lowered it slightly, adjusting the angle as if to frame the conversation on her terms. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried an unspoken command. This moment belonged to her now. Her eyes never left Crockett. The room, so still a moment before, buzzed in anticipation. Then, with the smoothness of a practiced politician, Greene spoke, her voice cool and dispassionate, cutting through the room with clinical precision. I understand the pain, she said, her tone neutral, almost patronizing in its flatness. But if we start making national policy based on emotion, This country will go bankrupt. The words were slow, deliberate, each one a calculated stroke designed to extinguish the fire that Crockett had ignited. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. It was as if she was dismissing not only the people in that room, but the very lives behind their struggles. She reduced their suffering to numbers, to costs. No compassion, no understanding, just cold, sterile efficiency. The words lingered in the air like smoke. A few in the room shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her statement pressing down, but none spoke out. There was no need. Greene had already set the stage, and the few allies she had in the room knew the game. A Republican lawmaker seated on the other side of the room gave a subtle nod, a silent approval. His expression remained stoic, his eyes never wavering from the proceedings. But the gesture was enough. It was a signal. This was the way forward. And Crockett? She was nothing more than an obstacle in their path. Crockett didn't respond immediately. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she rush to make a counterattack. No, she remained still, her body rooted in the gravity of the moment, her focus never leaving Greene. She turned her head just slightly, a small shift, an almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough to carry the weight of 1,000 thoughts. Her gaze cut into Greene, sharp and steady, as though she were studying the very core of the woman before her. There was no tremor in her expression, no hesitation. Her eyes, however, were another story. They were cold, cold like iron heated to the point of breaking. The look was unmistakable. It was not the expression of a politician responding to a rebuttal. It was the look of someone who had been pushed to the edge of patience and was now preparing to tear that edge apart. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the stillness of her demeanor, the intensity of her gaze. The room seemed to hold its breath. Greene, oblivious or perhaps unbothered by the weight of that stare, continued to speak. But the power had shifted. What had been a moment of arrogance from Greene now seemed almost like a trap, waiting for the inevitable response that would turn the room on its head. In that stillness, Crockett did not need to say anything. Her silence was more cutting than any words could be. It was a promise, an unspoken vow. This fight was far from over. The moment stretched, suspended between silence and inevitable confrontation. Crockett knew the stakes now. This wasn't just about words. This wasn't just about a policy battle. This was about the lives of families who had trusted the system to protect them. Greene had already made her case, cold and unyielding. But Crockett was not here to merely argue. She was here to expose the truth, to make sure that truth couldn't be buried under budget cuts or political rhetoric. Her fingers brushed the table, steadying herself as she clicked a button on her tablet. The projector hummed to life, casting a sharp beam of light against the far wall. A sleek, color-coded graph appeared, outlining a brutal truth in black and white clarity. On the left side, the numbers rose like jagged mountains. Alzheimer's care costs, 2025, $290 billion in bold, unforgiving letters. The graph's upward slope didn't taper, didn't level out. It skyrocketed, as if mocking the idea that the disease could be contained or mitigated by slashing funding. It was a terrifying visual, the cost of care mirrored by the increasing toll of lives, of human suffering. And on the right side of the graph, a single, simple line of red text appeared. Crockett's voice rang out, clear, with unshakable conviction. "Cutting the budget doesn't stop the disease," she said, the words sharp as a whip. "It doesn't erase Alzheimer's. It just ensures more families will suffer, more will die. It doesn't save money, it kills more people." The room hung in the balance as the weight of her statement settled. The camera zoomed in on her face, eyes cold, unwavering, yet laced with the raw power of undeniable truth. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't need to. The numbers on the screen were the evidence, and they spoke louder than any politician's rhetoric ever could. She paused for just a moment, letting the reality of those figures sink in. Behind her, the audience stirred, a palpable sense of discomfort running through the rows of spectators. Some glanced down at their hands. Others shifted in their seats. The uncomfortable truth was out in the open. Greene's financial logic was a sterile theory, divorced from the human cost. But Crockett had brought the faces, the families, into the equation. This was no longer about policies on paper. This was about people, families, lives. And if anyone dared to ignore that, they would have to face her. The room, still thick with the weight of Crockett's words, seemed to grow even heavier. The reality of the numbers, $290 billion, had struck a nerve. But now Crockett shifted gears. She wasn't here to show the cold facts. She was here to remind them, all of them, of the human cost behind the charts. The cost that no spreadsheet could capture, no budget cut could fix. She took a breath, steadying herself, then let the words fall from her lips. Slow, deliberate, cutting straight through the silence. 75% of caregivers are family members, she began, her voice low but resolute. They're mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. They don't get paid. They don't get time off. They work day in and day out, without a single moment to rest. For 10 years, they care for their loved ones. And when they're done, when the burden's been carried, no one remembers their names. Her words hit like a hammer, each one striking harder than the last. The camera lingered on the faces in the room, capturing the weight of what she had just said. Some lawmakers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the floor, unable to meet the truth. Others, those who had come here to make policy decisions, sat frozen, their stoic faces cracked with the tension of what they were hearing. Their pens moved faster now, scribbling notes they couldn't ignore. And there was Greene, ever the embodiment of cold logic, sitting with her arms crossed, a fortress of defiance against the emotional storm sweeping through the chamber. But even she seemed to flinch, just the slightest clench of her jaw. She couldn't hide it completely, not when Crockett had peeled back the mask of policy and revealed the beating heart beneath it. The camera panned slowly across the room, capturing the reluctance, the discomfort, the flicker of realization in those who had remained indifferent moments before. The faces of those who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen the truth that Crockett was serving to them, raw and undiluted. There was no chart, no policy, just families, lives, and memories slipping through the cracks of a system that had long since lost its compassion. Crockett didn't pause. She didn't give them a moment to forget. Her gaze cut across the room, sharp and steady, as if daring anyone to deny what she'd just exposed. 10 years for nothing, forgotten. And you think cutting funding will fix this? The words were like a slap to the face, unrelenting in their urgency. And as the silence stretched, Crockett's eyes locked on Greene's. And for just a fleeting moment, the weight of that silence pressed down on her, on all of them. The camera held a shot, a single moment that felt like an eternity. The tension that hung in the room was thick, suffocating even, as Crockett's words lingered in the air. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on Greene, waiting for her to respond, expecting her to crumble under the weight of the truth that had just been laid out. But Greene, as always, remained a picture of unyielding control. Her posture was perfect, her arms crossed, her gaze unflinching. She didn't seem moved, at least not outwardly. Instead, she took a moment, as though carefully selecting her next move, before she leaned forward slightly, the faintest glimmer of a smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a smile of empathy or even acknowledgement. It was a smile of confidence, one that said, "I've got this." It was the smile of someone who had long ago made peace with the harsh realities of governance. Someone who believed that the cuts they were about to make were not just necessary, but inevitable. With a deliberate, almost dismissive motion, Greene lowered her microphone just a fraction of an inch. Then with a slow exhale, she began to speak, her voice calm, but cutting like a blade through the fragile tension that had built. "Let me remind you," she said, her words deliberate, measured, each one falling with the weight of a decision already made. "The budget is not about emotion. If we don't make these cuts here, we'll have to slash something else. Education programs, STEM initiatives, even child nutrition. We will have to choose between a future and a memory." The words were clinical, like a doctor delivering bad news with a cold smile. She paused, letting the implications of her statement settle in the room. The camera captured her every move, her steady gaze, her unmoving posture. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like she was relishing the discomfort of the room, like she had won this argument before it even began. Crockett, however, was unshaken. Greene wasn't finished yet. "I choose the future over memory," she said, the finality in her voice a sharp contrast to the raw emotion that had filled the room moments before. The words were a simple declaration, one that reduced the value of human lives to a mere calculation, to a choice between cold, hard pragmatism and a sentimentality she considered unnecessary. The room was still. The words hung there, thick in the air, like a weighted blanket pressing down on everyone in the room. Greene had drawn a line in the sand, and now she was daring anyone to cross it. Crockett could feel it, a shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness that threatened to overwhelm her. But she wasn't about to let Greene's cold, calculated logic stand uncontested. She wasn't here to argue about numbers. She was here to remind them of the real people who would bear the brunt of their decisions. Without a word, Crockett reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the files inside. The room fell into a hush, the tension crackling like static in the air. As she slowly withdrew a thick folder from her briefcase, the sound of the paper rustling felt deafening in the silence. She placed the folder on the table in front of her with a deliberate, almost defiant motion. The soft thud echoed throughout the room, a sound that seemed to reverberate through every person present. The gesture wasn't subtle. It wasn't a simple move to shift the conversation. It was a declaration. This wasn't just paperwork. This wasn't just another set of numbers. This was proof. Proof of the lives lost, the families destroyed, and the human cost of their cold logic. And Crockett wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to let Greene erase the lives she had just put on display with a few well-placed words. The room felt suffocating as the words between Crockett and Greene settled into the air. Greene's logic hung there, cold and clinical, but it hadn't been enough to silence the truth. Crockett stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of the stakes. This wasn't just a budget debate anymore. It was a battle for humanity, a fight to ensure that the people behind the policies, the ones who lived and died by these decisions, were seen. Her gaze never wavered from Greene as she made the deliberate decision to bring something far more personal into the conversation. She turned slowly, her hand brushing against the thick stack of paper she had brought with her. She lifted it from the table, the weight of it pressing down on her arms. But it wasn't just paper. It was a tangible truth. The weight of the fight, the sacrifice of millions of families, was in this stack, in these signatures. And Crockett wasn't about to let anyone ignore it. With purpose, she made her way toward the witness table, each step echoing in the heavy silence that had descended. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor was the only sound, a metronome marking the passage of time. Every eye in the room was locked on her, waiting for her next move. As she reached the table, she placed the pile of papers down with a resounding thud. The sound was sharp, immediate, a punctuation mark in the quiet tension. It echoed, a silent declaration. This was not a game, not a political chess match. This was real. 1,000,000 signatures in 9 days, Crockett began, her voice unwavering, as though each syllable had been forged in fire. The majority of them are from those who have cared for Alzheimer's patients, those who have given their time, their energy, and their lives to these people. People who know what it's like to watch someone you love disappear in slow motion. And yet they are ignored. Their voices are drowned out by numbers that do not reflect the human cost. Her words didn't need to be louder. Their weight was enough to carry them. She let the quiet settle in between her sentences, giving the room time to digest what she had just said. This wasn't a question of policy. This was a question of who mattered. And for Crockett, the answer was clear. The families, those people who had signed that petition, those who had spent years caring for their loved ones without recognition, they mattered. She paused for just a moment, then slowly turned to face Greene. Their eyes locked. The room was still. Too still. The air seemed to constrict. Crockett's voice cut through the silence with a quiet, powerful conviction. This isn't about emotion. This is about the people. This is about the families who have given everything and received nothing in return. And you, Ms. Greene, are standing here, pretending that their sacrifice is just a line item on a budget sheet. The words fell with precision, each one an unflinching reminder that policy could not afford to overlook the lives at the heart of it. Crockett wasn't looking for sympathy. She was demanding accountability. The camera zoomed in slowly on the pile of papers now resting on the table. The names of states began to appear, one by one, highlighted as the camera focused. California, Florida, Texas, Ohio. Each state a testament to the lives affected. Each signature a powerful declaration that they were not invisible. Crockett didn't need to explain it further. The camera did the work for her, each name that appeared on the screen louder than any word spoken in the room. The silence that followed was heavy. Greene's gaze shifted, just briefly, to the pile of papers before her eyes returned to Crockett. She couldn't ignore it. No one in the room could. The weight of those names was too much to disregard, and Crockett knew it. She didn't flinch. She stood firm, unwavering in the face of Greene's cold logic. Crockett's message was clear. The truth had been laid out before them, and there would be no turning away. The room was thick with tension, the air charged with unspoken thoughts, as Crockett's words echoed off the walls. But Greene's composure never faltered. Where others may have been rattled, she stood unbroken. The truth that Crockett had just laid bare, the faces, the names, the lives, seemed to have no effect on Greene. She simply adjusted her position in her chair, her body language giving nothing away. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, until Greene's voice cut through it, steady and devoid of emotion. "Has anyone verified the validity of these numbers?" Her voice was dry, almost mechanical, as if she were questioning the weather rather than the lives of millions. It wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a challenge, a dismissal wrapped in polite skepticism. Her gaze didn't shift. She stared ahead, focused solely on Crockett, daring her to respond with anything other than what Greene had already decided was the truth. The question hung in the air, charged with condescension. As if on cue, a dry laugh came from the independent side of the room, sharp, hollow, the kind of laugh that came not from humor, but from an attempt to dismiss the uncomfortable reality sitting in front of them. It was a sound that grated on the nerves, cutting through the heavy silence like a shard of glass. And yet, Crockett did not respond immediately. She didn't let herself be dragged into the trap of Greene's games. She stood still, her face a mask of calm resolve. There was no flinch, no anger. She knew the battle wasn't won with shouting or fiery words. It was won with truth, and it was time to show them the truth. Slowly, deliberately, Crockett reached for her briefcase. The soft rustle of leather filled the room, adding to the tension that had already settled thick in the air. Her hand moved with purpose, each motion controlled. Yet there was a slight tremor in her fingers, barely perceptible, just enough to reveal the weight of the moment. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was the weight of justice, the unbearable responsibility of having to force the truth into a room that wanted to close its eyes. She didn't rush. There was no need to hurry. The sound of the envelope tearing open was sharp, like the crack of a whip, cutting through the heavy silence. As the envelope came apart in her hands, the room seemed to lean forward, eyes focused on the document she was about to reveal. Crockett held the document up for a moment, allowing the room to settle on it, to see that this was no longer a question of rhetoric. It was a question of proof, evidence that couldn't be ignored. Crockett didn't need to explain what was inside the envelope. The camera caught every detail, the slight tremble of her hand as she held it out, the focus in her eyes as they stayed locked on Greene. She didn't need to say a word more. The document, the proof, was all that mattered. It was time for Greene and everyone else in that room to face the truth that couldn't be wiped away by dismissive questions or thinly veiled arrogance. The air in the room thickened once again, and Crockett knew the moment had come. Greene had tried to deflect, to redirect the conversation into numbers and dry policies, but Crockett wasn't going to let that happen. This wasn't about saving money. This was about people, about lives that had already been lost, about the suffering that had already been carried. The cold efficiency of Greene's arguments had ignored the heart of the matter. Now it was time to make sure no one in the room could ignore it any longer. Crockett reached into the pile of documents, her movements deliberate, careful. Her fingers brushed the edges of the folded letter, worn and slightly creased from time. It felt like it had been carried with someone for years, perhaps decades, and as she pulled it out, she knew that what was inside had the power to do what statistics never could. She took a slow, measured breath, the weight of her next words pressing on her chest. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the stillness of her face, the deliberate way she unfolded the letter, and the faint tremor in her hand. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but there, a testament to how much this mattered. The letter was short. There were no grand statements, no outpouring of emotion. It was simple, raw. The words themselves spoke volumes more than any carefully crafted argument could. Crockett began to read, each word carrying the weight of its own quiet power. "I am Eugene Davey," she began, her voice low but unwavering. "If one day I no longer remember who is who, please do not let anyone forget that I was a good father, a strong husband, and a United States Marine." The words seemed to hang in the air long after she finished reading them. The simplicity of the message was staggering. Do not let anyone forget. A plea not just for remembrance, but for dignity in the face of a future that would try to strip away every shred of identity. A man whose life had been defined by his service to his family, to his country, now asking not for mercy, but for the basic recognition of his humanity, his worth. And Crockett made sure that every person in that room felt it. A slight shift in the gallery, a woman wiping her eyes, a man squeezing his wife's hand a little tighter. It was subtle, but it didn't escape the camera. The words that had come from Eugene Davis weren't just about Alzheimer's. They were about being human, about not allowing the most vulnerable in society to be swept aside, forgotten, when they could no longer speak for themselves. They were about not letting the loss of memory be equated with the loss of value. Crockett folded the letter with deliberate care, a silent gesture of reverence for the words that had just been shared. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She didn't need to say another word. The letter had done its work. Her eyes lifted slowly, once again locking with Greene's. The room held its breath, and Crockett's gaze didn't waver. There was no need for further explanation, no need to plead for understanding. The truth had been laid out in front of them, bare and unassailable. The question was no longer about budget cuts or policies. It was about something far more fundamental, the humanity of those who would be affected by these decisions. And Crockett had made sure that everyone in that room knew it. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. The truth had been spoken, and now it was up to them to decide how to respond. The room had become suffocating in its stillness, and as Crockett stood there, the weight of her last statement settled like a stone in the pit of every stomach present. Greene's face remained an immovable mask, but Crockett could feel the crack in the veneer. For just a second, there had been the briefest flicker in her eyes, a tiny crack in the fortress of indifference that Greene had built. But Crockett wasn't going to let it pass. She wasn't going to let the room forget what was at stake. Her back straightened, spine locking into place, as if drawing every ounce of resolve from the core of her being. Her eyes, usually calm, now burned with an intensity that could set fire to the room itself. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It wasn't about debating policies. This was about lives, about the families who had been ignored, about the elderly who were treated as nothing more than statistics, and about the injustice that Greene had just wrapped in a cold veneer of logic. Crockett wasn't going to let that stand. She took one step forward, the movement slow but deliberate, her gaze never leaving Greene's face. Each step was like the quiet approach of a storm, building in strength, ready to break. Her voice, when it came, was steady and commanding, but the words carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten souls. If our parents, our loved ones, lose their memories, if they lose the very thing that makes them who they are they to be discarded? Crockett's voice didn't tremble, but there was something raw beneath the surface, something that trembled within her but refused to break free. Do they deserve to be forgotten? To be left behind as if they were nothing more than a burden? Her words landed with an almost physical impact, each syllable piercing through the room like an arrow aimed straight at the heart of Greene's cold logic. The chamber was frozen in place, the tension building in every moment of silence between her words. The camera panned across the room, capturing the faces of the other lawmakers. Some looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others staring ahead with brows furrowed, unable to ignore the force of Crockett's words. The camera then shifted, landing squarely on Greene's face. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowing, but no words came. There was no deflection this time, no quick retort. She was caught, and the silence stretched on. For a brief moment, Greene's eyes seemed to waver, her grip on her composure slipping ever so slightly. It was a small thing, a tightening of her jaw, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but it was enough to show that Crockett's question had struck at the heart of her carefully crafted argument. Greene was speechless, and for a moment the room seemed to breathe with the collective weight of what had just been said. Crockett didn't break eye contact. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering, like a lighthouse in a storm. She didn't need to say another word. Greene had been caught in the truth of every family who had given everything to care for their loved ones, the truth of every person who had been abandoned in the face of policy-driven indifference. As the seconds stretched on, the silence grew even more oppressive. It was no longer a debate. It was a moment of reckoning, a reckoning that Greene, for all her power, could not escape. Crockett had laid down the gauntlet. It wasn't about numbers or budgets anymore. It was about the lives that had been ignored, and Crockett's words, sharp and unyielding, had made sure that no one in the room could forget that truth. The silence in the room felt like it was stretching, like it was refusing to give way. Crockett stood there, unwavering, her words still hanging in the air, like a palpable force, waiting for someone to speak, to break the tension that had descended. But no one spoke immediately. The gravity of the moment was too heavy, too real. Greene remained silent, her face still hard, a slight twitch in her jaw, betraying the discomfort she felt, though she refused to acknowledge it. Crockett had done it. She had exposed the hollowness of the arguments she was up against. But Greene wasn't finished yet. She had more to say, more to do. But in this moment, Crockett's truth was the only thing that mattered, and she held that truth in the room, unwavering, as though daring anyone to challenge it. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, a lone figure at the back of the room began to stir. A single hand rose from the far end of the gallery, hesitantly at first, and then, like the ripple of a stone dropped into still water, more hands began to follow. A soft murmur spread throughout the gallery, growing in volume and intensity, a quiet, rising wave of agreement that seemed to reach every corner of the room. It wasn't loud at first, no cheering, no shouting, just a steady, almost reverential clap from one man in the back, followed by another and then another. The sound was quiet at first, but as it swelled, it became a wave, unmistakable, undeniable. People were standing. Their hands were raised, and for the first time that day, the room seemed to move in unison. And then it happened. A figure at the far back of the gallery, an elderly man dressed in the faded uniform of a veteran, rose from his seat with slow deliberation. His face was lined with the marks of years, of battles fought, of memories, perhaps even more fleeting than the ones Crockett had spoken of. But his eyes were sharp, focused. He stood tall, the weight of age and experience pulling him down. But his movements were still precise, still purposeful. He raised his hand slowly, lifting it to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute. His gesture was not a small one. It wasn't an ordinary show of respect. It was a military salute, reserved for the most solemn of moments when the honor of service demanded recognition. The room seemed to pause again. His salute wasn't just to Crockett, it was to the entire truth she had just forced into the light. It was an acknowledgement that went beyond the words spoken in that room. It was the recognition of a deeper sacrifice, one that hadn't been given the respect it deserved. It was the recognition that what Crockett had said was true, that the lives being affected weren't just numbers or statistics, but people who had given everything, who had served and loved and fought without asking for anything in return. As the old man stood there, his salute held in place, the gallery felt completely still. The soft murmur of clapping had quieted. The camera panned over the faces in the room, showing the subtle shift in their expressions. The faces that had once been cold, detached, now filled with the quiet recognition of the human cost that Crockett had so skillfully exposed. Some lawmakers, who had been nodding in agreement with Greene only moments ago, were now looking at each other, unsure, their faces betraying their discomfort. Others were focused, locked in that moment of solemnity, as though they too recognized that this wasn't a battle of policy anymore. This was a battle for the soul of the country, its values, its integrity, its humanity. The applause in the gallery wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it grew with every passing second. It wasn't about just agreeing with Crockett. It wasn't about being on her side. It was about recognizing the simple truth of what she had said, what every family, every caregiver, every person in that room understood. It was a truth that had been ignored for too long, that had been buried beneath budget cuts, fiscal policies, and the cold logic of numbers. But Crockett had forced it to the surface, and now there was no hiding from it. The old man's salute, his quiet tribute, had become the living embodiment of the recognition they had all been too afraid to give. Crockett stood tall, unwavering, as the camera caught the slow, measured applause that spread like wildfire through the room. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the clapping. She didn't need to. This wasn't about her. This was about the people who had been forgotten. This was about the families who had lived in silence for too long, who had carried the weight of Alzheimer's and other diseases without recognition, without support. And now, for the first time, someone was giving them a voice. Crockett's eyes remained fixed on the man in the back of the room, on his salute. The gesture wasn't just symbolic, it was a call to action, a reminder that the fight wasn't over, that every person in that room, every person in the country, had a responsibility to make sure that the voices of the vulnerable were heard. As the applause began to die down, the silence returned, thicker this time, heavier. But it was different now. It wasn't just an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of recognition, of understanding. It was the kind of silence that comes when the truth has been spoken, when there is nothing more to say because the truth has already been revealed. Crockett didn't look away. Her gaze remained steady, unflinching, as if daring anyone in the room to question what had just happened. The room, once divided, now seemed united in this single powerful truth. The sound of the veterans' salute still echoed in their minds, a solemn reminder of the sacrifice and dignity that had been demanded, and the responsibility that now rested on their shoulders. In that moment, Crockett had made sure that they would never forget, and she had shown them what true courage looked like, not in the bravado of words, but in the quiet strength of standing for what was right, even when the world seemed to be on the wrong side. As the room fell into the silence of Crockett's unspoken challenge, something shifted. The words that had been spoken, those words that carried the weight of every family affected by Alzheimer's, didn't just stay in that room. They didn't remain contained within the polished walls of the Capitol building. No, they broke free and rippled outward, spreading through the veins of the nation like wildfire. The moment that the video of Crockett reading Eugene Davis's letter was posted online, it took on a life of its own. A simple hashtag born from the raw power of the words spoken began to trend. My father still matters. It was just a hashtag, yet it captured everything that had been exposed in that chamber. The families, the caregivers, the forgotten. It was a declaration that could not be ignored. It became a symbol, a movement, a call to arms for anyone who had been left behind. Anyone who had been pushed aside in the name of fiscal responsibility, anyone who had given everything for someone they loved, only to watch as their sacrifice went unnoticed. Within hours, the clip of Crockett reading the letter, Eugene Davis's heartfelt plea, went viral. It was shared across platforms, from Facebook to Twitter, from Instagram to TikTok, and in just 2 hours, the video racked up an astounding 5 million views. The numbers were staggering, but they didn't matter. The real story wasn't the statistics. It was the faces of the people who had watched it. The elderly man in Ohio who had cared for his wife for 15 years. The mother in Florida who had given up her job to care for her daughter. The daughter in California who had watched her father's memory fade until she barely recognized him anymore. They were all watching, and they were all listening. They saw themselves in Eugene's letter. They felt his pain. They knew his loss. And they were not going to stay silent any longer. As the clip spread, so did the momentum. Thousands of shares, thousands of comments. The hashtags exploded. My father still matters. Remember them. Stop the cuts. The voices that had been silenced for so long were now demanding to be heard. The silence that had once been imposed by lawmakers, by political apathy, was now being shattered by a collective cry of outrage. It wasn't just the people in that room who were listening. It was the entire country. And they were no longer willing to accept the lies, the dismissals, or the ignorance that had been served up in the name of budget cuts. The camera zoomed in on the hashtag. The sheer simplicity of it was staggering. Just 5 words, my father still matters. But they were powerful enough to tear through the narrative of budgetary priorities, cutting right to the heart of the matter. The words still mattered because they were more than just words. They were the embodiment of the pain, the love, the sacrifice, the honor, and the memories that had been ignored for so long. No longer could they be dismissed. No longer could they be swept under the rug as if they were insignificant. These were lives, these were families, and they were demanding to be seen. Social media became a battleground, not just for policy debates, but for the very soul of the nation. The video, with its raw emotion, spread to every corner of the internet. It wasn't just people with direct experience of Alzheimer's who shared it. It was everyone who understood what it meant to love someone, to fight for them, to watch as they slipped away. The video wasn't just a message. It was a moment of collective consciousness, an awakening. In Washington, the echoes of the viral video reverberated through the halls. Lawmakers who had once been steadfast in their positions, who had clung to their budgets and their arguments, now found themselves forced to answer questions from their constituents. They couldn't ignore the voices that had suddenly become so loud. They couldn't pretend that the families who had been quietly suffering were just numbers on a page. The pressure was mounting, and Crockett knew that the battle was just beginning. But for now, in the quiet moments after the video had exploded across the nation, Crockett stood firm. Her words had left an indelible mark, not just on the room she had stood in, but on the entire country. And with every new view, every share, and every hashtag, it became clearer that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the room's atmosphere crackled with anticipation, Crockett stood still, her eyes locked on Greene. The silence had become a heavy weight, suffocating the chamber. Greene's face, though unchanged, seemed to reflect a slight shift in the air. There was no more pretending that her logic had gone unchallenged. She had been caught, but as was her nature, she wouldn't back down quietly. After a long pause, Greene finally broke the silence, her voice colder than ever, cutting through the tension like a blade. I will withdraw the proposal, pending further review, she said, her words calculated, mechanical. There was no apology in her voice, no acknowledgement of the humanity Crockett had put before her. It was merely a move, a stalling tactic, a way to regain control of the situation. She made her concession, but it was as hollow as her previous arguments had been. There was no remorse, no reckoning with the injustice Crockett had exposed. Greene's eyes remained cold and calculating, the slight rise of her chin signaling that she still believed she held the upper hand. But Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't about to let Greene get away with this shallow retreat. She had given the room the truth, and now she would give them the solution, a solution that would ensure no one could ignore the costs any longer. Crockett took a deliberate step forward, her movements smooth yet powerful. The room watched in quiet expectation. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Her silence was just as commanding, just as urgent as her words. The tension in the room was taut, everyone knowing that what she was about to propose would demand more than just polite consideration. It would demand action. I propose the creation of a national memory fund, Crockett said, her voice strong and unyielding. Her words didn't just fill the space, they carried. Not just to preserve the budget, but to double the funding for research into Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. To make sure that no family, no caregiver, no person affected by these diseases is ever forced to carry the burden alone again. The words hit the room like a shockwave. It wasn't a policy suggestion. It was a direct challenge to the system that had allowed these injustices to persist. Crockett wasn't just offering a solution, she was demanding that the government take responsibility for the suffering it had ignored for so long. She didn't just want to preserve the status quo, she wanted to change it. She wanted to ensure that future generations would not face the same battles, the same abandonment that had haunted the families and caregivers who had been forgotten. The silence in the room deepened, everyone aware that this was no longer a discussion about budgets. It was a moral stand. Greene, for the first time in the entire hearing, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. There was no sharp rebuttal, no attempt to diminish Crockett's proposal. She simply stared ahead, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew Crockett had just set the stage for a different kind of fight, a fight that wasn't about policy or numbers. It was about human dignity, and Crockett had just raised the stakes higher than Greene could have anticipated. Crockett's eyes never left Greene as she concluded with words that carried the weight of everything she had just said, everything she had fought for. Memories may fade, but humanity must never be allowed to forget. Her voice rang out, resonant and powerful, with the finality of a statement that left no room for misinterpretation. The camera lingered on her face, capturing the unwavering resolve in her eyes, the fire that burned there, one that had been kindled not by personal ambition, but by the thousands of people who had been left to suffer in silence. This wasn't just about Alzheimer's. This wasn't about politics. This was about ensuring that the most vulnerable were never forgotten again. For a moment, the room was still. The weight of her words was too much for any quick rebuttal. No one could deny what she had just said. Crockett had made her point, and now, with a simple yet powerful statement, she had forced the room to reckon with the truth. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was a silence filled with the gravity of change, silent yet pregnant with the realization that the conversation was no longer about money or policy. It was about the very essence of humanity and whether or not they were willing to act in the name of compassion. Greene's eyes flicked briefly to the side, but her silence spoke volumes. She had no response, not because she lacked words, but because Crockett had taken the conversation to a place where no words could undo what had been said. The room was now locked in the gravity of her challenge, and Crockett's final words lingered in the air, demanding a reckoning from everyone who had been too comfortable to care. The room remained heavy, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Crockett had forced the truth to the forefront, but Greene remained impervious, her stance as solid as ever. Yet Crockett's challenge had left its mark, an undeniable crack in the foundation of their debate. There was no going back from this moment. The silence that followed was not a quiet retreat from the battlefield, but a moment of reckoning. But now, as Crockett stood there, unwavering, a new understanding began to seep through the tension. She hadn't just exposed the financial and emotional stakes. She had drawn a line in the sand, making it clear that the real fight was not about policies or budgets. It was about something far more profound, the dignity of the human spirit, the inherent worth of every person, regardless of their ability to remember, to work, or to contribute in the way society deems valuable. And in that realization, Crockett understood the deeper battle that lay ahead. Her gaze never wavered as she looked around the room. Behind her, the video footage of Eugene Davis's letter still lingered, a reminder that those lives being affected by Alzheimer's, by this system, were not faceless, nameless statistics. They were human beings, each deserving of compassion, respect, and dignity. These weren't just abstract concepts. These were people who had sacrificed their time, their energy, their lives to care for others. Families who had been left to struggle without support. Caregivers who had been cast aside in the name of political expediency. And Crockett had made it clear, the system had failed them, but she wouldn't let them be forgotten. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the intensity of her expression. Her eyes, once calm, now burned with a quiet fire. The fight was no longer just about winning the debate. It was about making sure that no one in that room could leave without confronting the truth. Crockett had already raised the stakes. She had already forced them to reckon with the human cost of their decisions. And in doing so, she had set the stage for a broader, deeper question: what kind of society were they willing to be? The lesson was stark and unavoidable. The real moral battle was not about numbers or figures. It was about the value of a life. It was about how society chooses to treat the vulnerable, the forgotten, the sick. It was about what it meant to show compassion in the face of overwhelming adversity. And as Crockett's words hung in the air, it became clear that the issue at hand wasn't about saving dollars or saving budgets. It was about saving humanity itself. She didn't raise her voice, but her presence in that room spoke louder than any political rhetoric ever could. Her steady gaze was a challenge, not just to Greene, but to everyone present. And it wasn't a challenge of power, it was a challenge of morality. How could they claim to value life if they were so willing to disregard the lives of those who were suffering in silence? How could they justify cuts to a system that was already broken, already failing those who needed it most? The silence that followed wasn't just a lull in conversation. It was the sound of that challenge sinking in. Crockett's words, her proposal, had already been planted. The question now was whether anyone in that room had the courage to answer it. Her voice was calm, but with the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions, she spoke again, slow and deliberate. If we don't act, if we don't change the way we view those in need, we've failed as a society. We've failed those who fought, who loved, and who sacrificed everything for the betterment of others. We can't allow their legacy to be forgotten. We can't allow them to become invisible, to be erased in the name of cold, detached policy. And in that moment, Crockett realized that the fight wasn't just about one budget or one piece of legislation. It was about shifting the entire narrative. It was about challenging a system that had prioritized efficiency over empathy, that had viewed people as numbers on a spreadsheet instead of recognizing them as individuals, each deserving of respect and care. And as she stood there facing a room full of lawmakers, some of whom might not have understood the gravity of what she was asking, she knew that this battle had only just begun. The camera zoomed out slowly, capturing the faces of the room, some looking down, others focused, some still caught in the riptide of what had been said. In that silence, Crockett stood firm, unshaken by the power of the forces against her. Her mission was clear. She wasn't just fighting for policy reform. She was fighting for the heart and soul of the nation, for the ideals it was built upon: compassion, justice, and the unshakable belief that no one should be left behind, no matter how much their memory fades. This wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about ensuring that no one, not a single person, would ever again be forgotten. And Crockett was prepared to fight for that truth, no matter what it took. In the end, the lesson was clear. True humanity lies not in how we treat the strong, the rich, or the powerful, but in how we care for the weakest, the most vulnerable, and those who have nothing left to give. This was Crockett's fight. This was her call to action, and she wasn't backing down. The room was electric with tension, the weight of Crockett's words still pressing down on every shoulder in the chamber. She had set the stage, challenged Greene's cold dismissal, forced the room to reckon with the humanity behind the policy. But now it was time for action. No longer would the suffering of Alzheimer's patients be swept aside in the name of budget cuts. No longer would the families and caregivers be ignored, treated as invisible statistics. Crockett wasn't just here to make a statement. She was here to drive a change, to ignite a movement that could not and would not be undone. Her gaze never wavered as she looked at those in the room. Lawmakers, colleagues, adversaries, people who held the power to change the course of the nation, and yet some of them had become numb, content with the status quo. Crockett had come to shake them from that stupor. "We are at a crossroads," she began, her voice steady but laced with the fierce urgency of someone who knew the stakes. "We can choose to be the generation that looks away, that turns a blind eye to the suffering of our most vulnerable. Or we can choose to be the generation that acts, that shows compassion and courage in the face of adversity. The choice is ours, but we must act now." The room was still, the faces of the lawmakers unreadable. But Crockett knew that the time for words was over. The time for action was here. She stepped forward, her voice rising with intensity, not to shout, but to speak with the force of truth itself. I propose we create a national memory fund, she said. The words a declaration that sent a ripple through the room. Not just to preserve the budget, but to double the funding for Alzheimer's research and care, to ensure that every person who has ever cared for a loved one with Alzheimer's has the support they deserve, to guarantee that no one has to face this battle alone, that the dignity of every human being is upheld. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, her eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to disagree. This is not just about numbers, she continued, her voice calm but fierce. This is about our humanity. This is about how we, as a society, choose to treat our elders, our veterans, our parents, our children. We cannot afford to let their stories end in silence. We must give them the resources to fight. We must act, and we must do it today. The air was thick with the weight of her challenge. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the unyielding determination in her eyes. Crockett knew this wasn't just about changing a policy. It was about changing the very heart of the nation. The voices of the forgotten could no longer be ignored. She had given them a voice. Now it was time for everyone in that room to answer. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a high-stakes showdown, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and conservative pundit Candace Owens go head-to-head in a fiery debate about race, justice, and the future of America. With millions watching, Jasmine argues for systemic change, citing shocking statistics on racial inequality, while Candace insists that personal responsibility is the key to progress. The tension builds as both women lay bare their convictions, each determined to sway the nation's heart. Who will come out on top in this battle of ideals, and what truths will be uncovered along the way? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air in the congressional hearing room was thick with anticipation as the clock ticked closer to the moment of confrontation. The buzz of murmured conversations abruptly stopped as the doors swung open. Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman who had made a name for herself as a relentless advocate for justice, stepped forward with a calm but undeniable presence. Her eyes scanned the room briefly, her sharp mind calculating the challenge ahead. She had been in battles like this before, but today was different. Today, the stakes were higher. She was about to face off against Candace Owens, the conservative pundit who had become infamous for dismissing systemic racism and for mocking the very movements that sought justice for marginalized communities. Jasmine's every step seemed to reverberate with purpose. She was not just a representative, she was a symbol of every Black person who had been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. She had fought tooth and nail to make it this far, knowing the obstacles that came with being both Black and a woman in a system that had not been built for her to succeed. Every victory was hard-won, every inch of progress earned with the sweat of those who came before her. Now, in front of the most powerful figures in the country, she would bring that fight to the floor. As she took her place at the podium, Candace Owens sat across from her, her expression poised and defiant. Owens had built her platform on opposing movements like Black Lives Matter, claiming that race was no longer a factor in America's social fabric. She had made a career out of downplaying the realities of systemic oppression, positioning herself as a beacon for those who believed that the notion of racial inequality was an antiquated narrative. To her, Jasmine was just another voice trying to divide the country, another pawn in the game of victimhood. She was ready to shut down the debate before it even began. Candace Owens leaned forward, her posture sharp, eyes locked on Jasmine. The room held its breath. "Let's cut through the nonsense," she began, her voice slicing through the air with precision. "This talk of systemic racism, it's a myth. It's just a construct created by progressives to explain away failure. It's nothing more than a crutch for people who don't want to take responsibility for their own lives. You talk about a system holding you back, but the reality is far simpler than that. People are held back by their choices, not the color of their skin." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, the room hanging on her every syllable. In today's America, anyone, no matter their race, has the same opportunity to succeed. If you work hard enough, if you put in the effort, success is there for the taking. It's as simple as that. Candace's voice gained strength with every word, her confidence undeniable. The world isn't divided by race anymore. The barriers we face are not because of racism. They are personal barriers. Your community has the same opportunities as anyone else. It's time people stop blaming the system and start taking responsibility for their own choices. That's the only way forward. Her gaze never left Jasmine. She'd made her point, sharp and firm, yet there was a subtle shift in the room. The words Candace had spoken were certain, but the reaction they provoked wasn't. She had made her argument, but Jasmine's steady silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The stage was set for a pivotal moment in the U.S. Capitol. Jasmine Crockett, a passionate Democratic representative from Texas, stood at the podium to present her bill for educational reform, aiming to ensure equal access to quality education for low-income children. Her words called for greater investment in underfunded public schools, emphasizing that every child deserved a chance at a better future. Across the room, Lauren Boebert, a staunch Republican from Colorado, watched with quiet disapproval. Known for her conservative stance and skepticism of government spending, Boebert believed in cutting costs, not increasing them. She saw Jasmine's bill as another costly measure that would add to the national debt and argued that the solution lay in school choice and parental involvement, not more government funding. The debate was about to begin with clear divisions. Jasmine fighting for educational equity, while Boebert focused on fiscal responsibility and limited government. Jasmine's proposal sought to tackle disparities in education funding, while Boebert dismissed it as ineffective, favoring school choice instead. The stage was set, and the battle for America's education system was about to unfold. Jasmine's words hung in the air, powerful and unyielding, as the weight of her argument settled over the room. The silence was thick, the tension palpable. Jasmine had laid bare the truth. Systemic racism was not just a relic of the past. It was a living, breathing force that shaped the futures of millions. But Candace Owens, ever the adversary, was not about to back down. She shifted in her seat, her smile never faltering, and leaned forward, her gaze steely. "Jasmine," Candace began, her voice sharp and cutting through the stillness. "What you're talking about isn't racism. It's a broken education system. The problem here isn't race. It's the failure of the education system itself. The system isn't designed to favor anyone based on skin color. It's designed to fail everyone in poor neighborhoods, regardless of race." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, the edge of her argument becoming more pronounced. But this isn't the fault of some unseen, all-powerful system holding people back. The truth is, if the Black community wants to change, they need to stop blaming the system and start changing themselves. It's about personal responsibility, Jasmine. It's about taking ownership of one's future, not pointing fingers at the system. Candace's eyes locked with Jasmine's, her expression resolute, as she leaned back, clearly confident in her rebuttal. "You want to see change? Fine. But it doesn't start by blaming a system that, in your eyes, is too powerful and impossible to change. It starts with self-reliance, with people in communities like yours looking inward, asking themselves what they can do to rise above. The victim mentality isn't going to get anyone anywhere, and that's the truth no one wants to hear." Jasmine could feel the sharp sting of Candace's words, the clear attempt to shift the blame. It was a defense she had heard too many times before. The old narrative that communities struggling under the weight of systemic inequality simply needed to do better, without confronting the realities of the system that kept them down. Candace's words, though polished and full of confidence, were just another form of gaslighting. Jasmine wasn't about to let it slide. She met Candace's gaze head-on, her voice steady, but with a quiet fire beneath it. "So let me get this straight," Jasmine said, a slight edge creeping into her voice. "You're telling me that the problem isn't racism, it's a broken education system, that people are held back by their own lack of effort, their own inability to rise above? Because it sure sounds to me like you're asking people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps when they're not even given boots to begin with. The room seemed to breathe in unison as Jasmine's words landed, each syllable heavy with the truth that Candace had just tried to deflect. Jasmine wasn't finished, though. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Candace's. You want to talk about personal responsibility? I'm all for it. But let's talk about the responsibility of a system that won't even give people the resources they need to succeed. Let's talk about how it's not just about working harder. It's about being given the opportunity to work in the first place. Candace Owens's response was coming, but Jasmine was ready. She wasn't about to let Candace get away with reducing the issue to self-improvement without acknowledging the larger structural forces that kept people in a constant state of struggle. Jasmine's voice had grown stronger, the tension in the room rising with every word, and it was clear. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a battle of truth against denial, and Jasmine was ready to take the fight to the next level. As the silence hung thick in the room, Jasmine took a deep breath, grounding herself. She could feel Candace's dismissive tone still echoing in the air, but she wasn't finished. The stakes were too high, the truth too important to be ignored. Jasmine knew that if she was going to truly dismantle the myth Candace was trying to perpetuate, she had to get to the heart of it, the very real life-and-death consequences of systemic inequality. Jasmine's gaze hardened as she spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of a harsh reality. Let's talk about healthcare, Candace. Let's talk about how Black women are treated in the healthcare system. Did you know that Black women in this country are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women? 3 to 4 times more likely to lose their lives bringing new life into the world. Jasmine's words dropped into the room like stones, each fact cutting deeper than the last. These are not just statistics. These are real women. These are mothers, daughters, sisters, lives lost because the system doesn't value us the same way it values others. The room had gone silent, every ear hanging on her words. Jasmine's eyes never left Candace's. And let me tell you something else, she continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made every word resonate. I'm a Black woman, Candace. I've had to fight every single step of the way to make sure my health is taken seriously. I've had to push for doctors to listen to me, to believe that my pain is real, to acknowledge that my concerns are valid. And I'm not the only one. There are millions of women just like me, women who are being dismissed, overlooked, or ignored by the very system that's supposed to keep us safe. Jasmine's chest tightened, but she held firm. This is about more than just individual choices, Candace. This is about a system that treats Black bodies differently. It's about a healthcare system that's failing us at every turn, and it's costing us lives. I've lived it, Candace. I've had to fight just to be heard by the very people who are supposed to take care of me. Her words were fierce now, each syllable a challenge. You can't sit there and tell me that this is just about personal responsibility. Because the reality is, when your access to care is limited, when your voice is silenced, when your life is devalued by the very system meant to protect you, you don't stand a chance. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Candace Owens, who had always prided herself on being able to brush aside arguments like these, seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. But she quickly regained her composure, leaning forward with a steely look in her eyes. Jasmine, she said, her voice sharp, what you're talking about is not racism. It's personal responsibility. If people take care of themselves, if they're healthy, these issues wouldn't be as prevalent. The problem isn't the system, it's the choices people make. You can't blame the system for everything. We all have to take responsibility for our own health. Candace's words were delivered with the precision of someone who had been well rehearsed in this line of argument, but Jasmine could feel the hollowness in them. She had heard this rhetoric before, the idea that individuals should somehow rise above systemic oppression by simply making better choices. But Jasmine knew better. The fight wasn't just about individuals making better decisions. It was about an entire system that had stacked the deck against people like her and far too many others. Jasmine's eyes never wavered, the heat of her words matching the intensity of her gaze. Candace, you can keep blaming the individual, But that doesn't change the fact that the system is killing us. You can keep saying it's about personal choices, but you're ignoring the reality that when the system doesn't even care enough to give people equal access to quality healthcare, those choices aren't fair. You can't choose good healthcare when it's being withheld from you because of the color of your skin. Her voice, though calm, held a razor-sharp edge that could cut through any denial. This isn't about one person's poor decisions. This is about an entire community being subjected to inferior care, and it's costing people their lives. So don't sit there and tell me that personal responsibility is the only thing that matters. Because if the system won't give people the tools they need to succeed, then we are all bound to fail. The room held its breath. Jasmine had made her point, loud and clear. Candace Owens had no retort. She could feel the weight of Jasmine's words pressing in on her, the truth that was so undeniable, so powerful that there was no easy way out. Candace was left with nothing but the shaky foundation of her own argument, crumbling under the weight of Jasmine's lived experience and hard facts. Jasmine, standing tall, knew she had won this battle because the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, had finally been spoken. The room was thick with tension after Jasmine's searing words about healthcare. Candace's earlier confidence had been shaken, but she quickly composed herself. Yet Jasmine wasn't done. She wasn't just here to talk about healthcare. She was here to address the system as a whole, the system that had shaped both her life and the lives of so many others like her. And now, with the weight of truth behind her every word, she was going to expose just how deep the roots of injustice ran. Candace, you talk about personal responsibility, but let me ask you this, Jasmine said, her voice low but unwavering. How do you explain the disproportionate sentences Black people receive in the criminal justice system for committing the same crimes as white people? The room seemed to hold its breath as Jasmine's gaze never left Candace's, a challenge hanging in the air between them. You want to talk about responsibility? You want to pretend that the system isn't rigged? Well, I've seen the proof, and I've seen the injustice firsthand. Jasmine took a step forward, her tone becoming more intense. Let me give you a few examples, Candace. You can look at the case of Khalif Browder, a 16-year-old who was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. He spent 3 years in Rikers Island, 2 of them in solitary confinement, without ever being convicted of a crime. 3 years of his life taken from him, all because the system wasn't built to treat him fairly. And this isn't just one case. It's countless others, Black and brown kids, whose lives have been shattered by a system that treats them differently from their white counterparts. Jasmine's voice was steady, but the pain of what she was saying was evident. And then there's the case of George Floyd, an unarmed man murdered in broad daylight with a knee on his neck for over 8 minutes. You can't tell me that's not racism, Candace. You can't tell me that's not part of the system. How many Black men and women have to die before we acknowledge that the system isn't treating everyone equally? The room was silent, each word from Jasmine cutting deeper. She wasn't just recounting cases. She was painting a picture of the injustice that had defined her life, the lives of her loved ones, and the lives of millions of Black Americans. Candace, for the first time in this debate, seemed to falter, but only for a moment. She straightened herself, the defensiveness returning. Jasmine, those are tragedies, yes, but you're focusing on outliers, exceptional cases. The system doesn't work that way. Those cases don't represent the whole. The criminal justice system is not inherently racist. These are just a few isolated incidents that have been blown out of proportion by the media. The truth is, people are being treated fairly. Candace's voice was sharp, but it lacked the same confidence it had carried earlier. She had no answer to Jasmine's forceful argument, only empty deflections. Jasmine stood there, her expression unwavering, but the fire in her eyes grew more intense. Isolated incidents. Is that what you call them, Candace? Isolated. She shook her head, her voice becoming more powerful. How many more incidents have to occur before you understand that this is not isolated? This is systemic. The numbers don't lie. Black people are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white people in the United States. We're given harsher sentences for the same crimes, and we face discrimination at every step of the process, from arrest to trial to sentencing. This isn't just a few bad apples. This is the system. This is what we live with every single day. Jasmine's words hit like a storm, shaking the very foundation of Candace's argument. And you know what, Candace? This isn't just something I've read in a textbook. I've seen it, lived it. I've had family members, men who look just like me, thrown into prison for minor offenses, while their white counterparts walk free. I've seen the disparity in sentencing with my own eyes. And yet you sit here and tell me this system isn't racist? Candace's lips pressed into a thin line. She was grasping for control, for something, anything, that could deflect the onslaught of Jasmine's words. "You're making broad generalizations, Jasmine," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "These aren't examples of systemic racism. They're examples of failures within the system. It's not the system itself, but the people within it. If people would just take responsibility, we wouldn't see these outcomes. You can't blame the entire system for a few bad actors." But Jasmine was resolute, her voice cutting through the room with surgical precision. "The system doesn't just fail us, Candace. It's designed to. It's designed to criminalize Black bodies, to punish us more severely, to make sure we're incarcerated while white people get a slap on the wrist. You can't keep pretending that this is just about individual failures. It's bigger than that. It's the system itself that needs to be reformed, from the ground up." Jasmine's gaze never faltered as she locked eyes with Candace. The words had been spoken, the truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. It was clear. Candace's arguments, based on denials and surface-level analysis, had been shattered by the undeniable weight of Jasmine's lived experience and the hard facts she had laid bare. Jasmine's voice hung heavy in the air, her words sinking into the room like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading out across the faces of everyone listening. Candace Owens sat across from her, visibly unshaken, yet the weight of Jasmine's argument was undeniable. But Jasmine wasn't done. She couldn't be. There was more to say, more to expose, and the room was waiting. She straightened up, the energy in her body shifting from frustration to cold, sharp resolve. "Let me take this further, Candace. You want to pretend that the system is fair? Let me talk to you about two names that have become all too familiar: George Floyd and Breonna Taylor." Jasmine's words sliced through the silence, each name a reminder of the pain that millions had carried for far too long. George Floyd was murdered, Candace. Murdered in broad daylight, on video, with a knee pressed to his neck for over 8 minutes, pleading for his life. And Breonna Taylor, she was shot in her own home while sleeping, gunned down by police who broke into her apartment with a no-knock warrant. Jasmine's eyes never wavered from Candace's, the weight of her words anchored in the undeniable truth. These aren't just isolated incidents, Candace. These are glaring examples of how the system fails us, how it devalues Black lives, how it protects those who murder us, and how it allows those responsible to walk free while our lives are destroyed. The justice system didn't give George or Breonna the justice they deserved. It failed them. It failed their families. It failed the entire community. And yet, you want to tell me that this system isn't built to protect people based on the color of their skin? The room was still, Jasmine's words a quiet storm, each sentence a wave crashing against the fragile defenses of those who still believe the system could be trusted. These are not anomalies. They are reflections of how Black people are treated differently in this country. They are examples of how Black bodies are viewed as expendable, while white officers, white civilians, walk away with their lives untouched, their actions unchecked. So don't sit there and tell me that the system works for everyone when it is clearly rigged against people like me. Candace Owens shifted in her chair, her lips tightening as the force of Jasmine's words hit her like a barrage. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come at first. Then with a determined look, she spoke, trying to regain control. "These are tragedies, Jasmine, yes, but they don't represent the entire system. The justice system isn't perfect, but these are isolated cases. There are always going to be bad actors, but that doesn't mean the whole system is corrupt. People need to be held accountable, but we can't blame the system for every crime." Jasmine's eyes darkened, a quiet anger simmering just beneath the surface. She wasn't backing down. "Isolated? You call these isolated incidents?" Jasmine shot back, her voice rising, matching the intensity in her chest. How many isolated incidents does it take before you realize the system is designed to fail us? How many Black lives need to be lost for you to see that these are not just bad actors? These are the actions of a system that refuses to value our lives equally, that refuses to hold its own accountable when we are the ones who pay the price. Her words were sharp, cutting through Candace's defenses with surgical precision. I've seen this firsthand, Candace. I've had a friend, a dear friend, who was sentenced to 25 years for a crime that a white person would have walked away from with probation. Do you think that's justice? Do you think that's fair? Jasmine's voice was steady, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. He was a Black man, and the system didn't see him as a person. It saw him as a statistic, a number in a machine that churns out sentences to keep people like him in prison. Jasmine's chest tightened as she spoke, the pain of her friend's story still fresh in her heart. He was a good man, Candace. A man who had made mistakes, yes, but who had turned his life around. And yet the system did not see him as deserving of the same chance at redemption that someone else might have had. And why? Because he was Black. That's the system you're defending. Candace Owens shifted in her seat, her confidence starting to fray. You can't judge the entire system based on a few cases, she said, her voice slightly less assured. The justice system is based on laws, not on race. If people commit crimes, they need to be punished accordingly, regardless of their skin color. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She leaned in, her words no longer measured but full of raw, undeniable conviction. You think it's about the law? You think this is just about punishment? Jasmine's voice dropped, but it carried an even deeper weight. When you see a man who's been incarcerated for years for a minor crime, when you see the lives of Black people destroyed by a system that's rigged against them, that's not just about the law. That's about a system that has been built to control and suppress people like me, people who will always have to fight twice as hard to be seen as equal. And you can't keep pretending that this is just about crime. This is about race. The room was silent again, the air thick with the truth Jasmine had laid bare. Candace Owens had no response, no argument left to make. Jasmine had shown the deep, irreparable flaws in the justice system that Candace had defended. Jasmine had exposed the cracks, and they were undeniable. She had made it clear that the debate wasn't about isolated incidents. It was about a system that consistently failed people based on the color of their skin. Jasmine stood tall, her voice calm but filled with the undeniable power of truth. This isn't about crime, Candace. This is about fairness. This is about justice. And this system isn't just failing Black people. It's designed to fail them. And I will keep fighting, keep speaking out, until we make sure it fails no one else. Jasmine stood there, her body still, every word she had spoken hanging in the air like a storm that had yet to break. Candace's defense of the current system had faltered, but Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. There was more to be done, more to be said. The truth she had laid out wasn't just about pointing out injustice. It was about fighting to change the very system that had caused it. And now she was going to make sure that change was part of this conversation. She took a deep breath, letting the tension in the room build around her, before stepping forward once again. Candace, she began, her voice sharp but full of purpose. You keep talking about individual responsibility, but let me tell you something. The system doesn't give us the same chance to succeed. It's not enough to just work harder. We need a system that works for us. That's why I'm here today, not just to talk about these failures, but to demand the reforms we need to fix them. Jasmine's eyes burned with intensity as she spoke, her voice unwavering. We need real structural change in our justice system. We need comprehensive police reform that holds officers accountable for their actions, and we need training programs that emphasize racial sensitivity and de-escalation. Officers need to understand that Black lives are not less important, that we are not to be feared, but to be respected. And it starts with rethinking how we train our police force, how we address the deep-seated biases that are woven into the fabric of law enforcement. She paused for a moment, her gaze moving across the room, catching the eyes of the audience. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for fairness. I'm asking for a system that values all lives, not just the ones that fit a certain mold. This isn't about a few bad cops, Candace. This is about the culture of policing, about the systems in place that allow racial profiling and brutality to go unchecked. And we need to change that. Jasmine's voice steadied as she pressed on. I know some of you don't want to hear this. You don't want to believe that these reforms are necessary, that we need a new kind of justice. But it's not enough to say, stop resisting. We need to create a society where people don't have to fear for their lives when they encounter law enforcement, where Black and brown people aren't forced to prove their worthiness for basic human dignity. Her words were like a hammer, striking the very foundation of the status quo. And we're already seeing progress. Programs like the one in Camden, New Jersey, where the police department was restructured to emphasize community trust and accountability, have shown that change is possible. But that kind of change takes willpower. It takes dedication, it takes leadership, and most importantly, it takes the courage to face uncomfortable truths. The weight of her words sank into the room, each one building a sense of urgency, a call to action that couldn't be ignored. Jasmine wasn't just speaking from theory, she was speaking from lived experience. And it was clear, she was ready to keep pushing for these reforms until they were reality. But Candace wasn't ready to concede. She leaned forward, her posture rigid, her voice sharp with the same self-assurance it had held throughout the debate. Jasmine, she said, you're talking about change, but you're missing the point. These programs you're advocating for, they're not the answer. They're just more of the same, more victimhood, more excuses. You're perpetuating a narrative that says Black people can't succeed without special treatment, without help from the system. What people need is to take responsibility for themselves, not wait for a handout from a broken system. Candace's voice rose as she spoke, her eyes challenging Jasmine's, trying to regain control. These so-called reforms don't empower people. They keep them in a state of dependency. They encourage people to stay stuck, to accept their circumstances, to believe that the system will always be the problem. But the truth is, Jasmine, people can change their lives if they take responsibility for their actions, for their choices. Jasmine stood still, the intensity of Candace's words only fueling her resolve. She had expected this. Candace had built her entire argument on the idea of personal responsibility, disregarding the realities of a system that wasn't built to give Black Americans a fair shot. Jasmine knew that if she was going to make an impact, she had to dismantle this argument piece by piece. She took a step forward, her voice calm but resolute. Candace, the problem isn't about giving people handouts or making excuses. It's about giving people a fair chance. When you tell someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps without even giving them boots to begin with, you are asking them to fail. You're asking them to navigate a system that was built to keep them down, and you're asking them to do it with one hand tied behind their back. Jasmine's words cut through the air, her message clear. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for fairness. I'm asking for a system that gives people a chance to succeed, regardless of their skin color. And that starts with police reform, with training, with holding people accountable. It starts with recognizing that Black lives do matter, and that it's time for this country to prove it by making real changes. The room was still, the air thick with the gravity of her message. Candace, though poised, could no longer hide the flicker of doubt that crossed her face. Jasmine had just shattered the argument Candace had been holding on to, an argument that couldn't stand up against the truth of lived experience. Jasmine stood firmly, the air around her charged with the gravity of her words. She had already shattered Candace's defenses with hard truths, but now she was preparing to take the conversation to a deeper level. Candace might try to sidestep the uncomfortable realities of systemic racism, but Jasmine wasn't finished. The fight was far from over. She stepped closer to the podium, her voice unwavering as she addressed Candace once again. Candace, you've heard of the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm sure. And I'm sure you've heard all the things people like you have to say about it, the critiques, the condemnations. But let me tell you this. Black Lives Matter is not just a hashtag. It's a call for justice. It's a call to expose a reality that has been swept under the rug for too long. Jasmine's eyes were piercing, her words deliberate. This movement, despite all the noise against it, has done something revolutionary. It has forced America to confront the racism that's embedded in the very fabric of our society. It's forced us to see the brutality, to see the injustices, and to recognize that this is not just a series of isolated incidents, it's a pattern. And that pattern continues to cost lives. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Do you think that's not important, Candace? Do you think that shining a light on the truth that Black lives have been devalued in this country for centuries, doesn't make a difference? Jasmine's voice sharpened, the intensity building as she spoke. The Black Lives Matter movement has sparked the change we've been waiting for. It has forced people to listen. It has created real measurable changes in our communities. It's led to police reforms in cities like Camden, New Jersey, and it's started conversations that, despite your attempts to shut them down, will not be ignored. Jasmine's tone became more impassioned, her fists clenching slightly as she recalled the strides the movement had made. Because of BLM, we've seen the end of cash bail in some states. We've seen police departments rethinking how they engage with communities. And we've seen people of all races, Black, white, brown, standing together, demanding that the lives of Black people be treated with the same value as anyone else's. That's the power of this movement, Candace. And that's why you can't just dismiss it as some radical fringe. It's a reflection of the need for change. The room was still, Jasmine's words carrying a weight of truth that couldn't be ignored. She had shown Candace that Black Lives Matter wasn't just a fleeting movement, it was a seismic shift in how America needed to reckon with its past and present. But Candace was not one to back down. With a sharp inhale, she straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't done yet. You talk about BLM like it's some kind of miracle worker, Jasmine. Candace snapped, her voice biting. But all it's done is create division. It hasn't healed anything. It hasn't solved any problems. What it's done is make people angry. It's fueled hatred between communities. It's been a weapon that divides, not unites. Candace's words were quick, defensive, as though she could feel Jasmine's argument slowly unraveling her own. You think it's helped communities? You think it's created change? Candace continued, her voice rising with an almost desperate edge. No, Jasmine. It's made things worse. It's turned peaceful protests into violent riots. It's created a culture where people of all races are afraid to speak the truth for fear of being labeled a racist. BLM has done nothing but deepen the divide between us. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She'd expected Candace's backlash. She'd heard it all before. The deflections, the attempts to shut down the conversation with false accusations. But Jasmine wasn't going to let that distract her. You can call it division, Candace, but what you're calling division is the sound of the truth finally being heard. What you're calling division is actually the breaking down of the walls that have kept the truth locked away for generations. People are finally listening, finally confronting the ugly history that's been hidden in plain sight. Her voice grew even firmer, more resolute. BLM isn't about fueling hatred. It's about demanding justice. It's about making sure that people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor didn't die in vain. It's about standing up for the dignity of every Black person in this country. And I will continue to fight for it, no matter how many times you try to silence it. The room held its breath. Jasmine had just flipped the script on Candace's argument, showing how the movement wasn't just a protest, but a necessary revolution. Candace's face had tightened, the veneer of certainty now cracked. The truth had been laid out, undeniable and bold. Jasmine wasn't just defending the movement, she was embodying its call for justice. And in that moment, she knew there was no turning back. She had exposed the real divide, not between people, but between truth and denial. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of Jasmine's words. She had made her point, but she wasn't done. There was more to the story, more layers of injustice that needed to be uncovered. Candace's dismissal of the reality of systemic racism was no longer just an abstract argument. It was a direct attack on everything Jasmine had fought for, everything that had shaped her life. And Jasmine wasn't going to let it slide. She had lived through this. She knew the truth of what Candace refused to see, and she was going to make sure that truth was heard. Jasmine's gaze hardened as she took a step forward, her voice steady but filled with undeniable force. Let's talk about the workplace, Candace. Let's talk about the reality of discrimination that people like me face every single day. Research shows that Black workers are less likely to be promoted, are paid less than their white counterparts, and are often denied equal opportunities despite having the same qualifications. And it's not just theory, it's a fact. A study from the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that Black people with the same qualifications as white people are still less likely to be hired. And when they are, they're paid significantly less. You want to talk about fairness, Candace? This is the real world we're living in. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the room. The audience was hanging on her every sentence. Jasmine wasn't just making an argument. She was telling the story of every Black worker who had been passed over, overlooked, or underpaid for no reason other than their race. And you know what? I've lived this. I've had to work twice as hard as anyone else to even get a seat at the table. When I entered politics, I wasn't just facing the challenges of being a woman, I was facing the added burden of being a Black woman. I had to prove myself over and over, fight for every single opportunity, not because I wasn't capable, but because the system wasn't built for me to succeed. Jasmine's voice was unwavering as she spoke, the intensity in her words building with each moment. When I walked into rooms full of white men in power, I had to be smarter, faster, more prepared. Because if I wasn't, my voice would be ignored. If I didn't meet their expectations, I wouldn't be seen as competent, just as another diversity hire. And I had to prove that I belonged every day, not just to others, but to myself. But you know what, Candace? That shouldn't be the reality. That shouldn't be something we have to fight for. We should all be given the same opportunity, the same shot, no matter what color our skin is. The tension in the room was palpable. Jasmine had just exposed a painful truth, one that Candace was desperately trying to ignore. Jasmine had lived this, fought for it, and seen the stark realities of the discrimination that Candace had denied. But Candace, ever the skeptic, wasn't backing down. She straightened in her seat, her gaze sharp, her words ready. "You can't blame the system for everything, Jasmine," Candace shot back. "The reason people succeed is because of personal effort, not because they're given some special treatment. You can't attribute success to race. It's about hard work, determination, and dedication to your goals. If you work hard enough, the system will reward you, regardless of your skin color." Candace's words dripped with conviction, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. She could feel the weight of Jasmine's truth pressing in on her. You want to talk about success? Then you need to look at people who've succeeded because of their efforts, not their skin color. I didn't get anywhere because of some handout. I got here because I worked for it. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard this narrative before. The myth that success was only about hard work, that race had nothing to do with opportunity. But Jasmine knew the truth, and she was done staying silent. Hard work is important, Candace, but let's not pretend that hard work is all it takes when the system is stacked against you. You can't just say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps when the boots aren't even being given to you. You can't ignore the fact that no matter how hard I worked, there were doors that were closed to me just because of the color of my skin. I had to fight for every opportunity, every promotion, every step forward, while others had it handed to them. And that's not just my experience. That's the experience of millions of Black people across this country. It's a system that makes you work twice as hard for half the recognition. Jasmine's voice was filled with conviction as she finished, her words like a punch in the gut. So don't sit there and tell me that it's all about personal responsibility. It's about a system that gives some people an unfair advantage. And I'm here to make sure we change that. Candace Owens shifted in her chair, but this time there was no easy comeback. Jasmine had just exposed the painful truth Candace had been unwilling to face, and there was nothing Candace could say that could undo the power of Jasmine's lived experience. The room held its breath, and for the first time, the tension in the air seemed to shift in Jasmine's favor. The tension in the room hung thick, the silence a loud contrast to the words that had just been exchanged. Jasmine had laid bare the undeniable truth of her struggles, of the deep systemic issues that plague communities like hers. Yet Candace Owens, sitting across from her, seemed unmoved. The weight of Jasmine's reality had not broken her resolve, but Jasmine could feel the moment shifting. The truth she had spoken was not easily dismissed. and Candace's attempt to undermine it only fueled her fire. Jasmine's gaze never wavered as she took a step forward, her voice calm but fierce. "You can try to ignore it, Candace," she said, the words cutting through the room with surgical precision. "You can sit there and pretend that this isn't happening, but you cannot deny that this system is unfair. You may not experience it in the same way I do, but I'll tell you this. Millions of Black people in this country are still fighting against discrimination every single day, and no amount of denial is going to change that." The room seemed to tighten around her, the weight of Jasmine's words undeniable. She wasn't just speaking for herself now. She was speaking for the millions who had been silenced, for the voices that had been drowned out by a system that refused to acknowledge them. You want to say it's all about personal responsibility? Fine. But when the system isn't even giving us the same starting line, when we're held back by biases and inequalities from day one, then that responsibility is meaningless. We don't all start at the same place, Candace, and you know it. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jasmine's gaze bore down on Candace with the kind of intensity that couldn't be ignored. She had made her point, and she wasn't backing down. Candace, for all her bravado, was now being forced to confront something much larger than herself, an uncomfortable truth that couldn't be easily erased. Candace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her previous confidence beginning to falter. But she wasn't about to let Jasmine's challenge stand unanswered. With a sharp breath, Candace sat up straighter, her lips curling into a tight smile. "What you're saying, Jasmine," Candace began, her voice laced with skepticism, "is just the same old narrative. A tired story about the oppression of Black people, a story that's been told over and over again. You're trying to create a storm where there's nothing but a wave of calm. You want to paint this picture of injustice, but the reality is most of it is in your head." Jasmine didn't flinch. She could feel the dismissiveness in Candace's words, the refusal to acknowledge the depth of the issue. But Jasmine was prepared. She had heard these arguments before. She had seen the way people like Candace tried to diminish the fight for equality, and she wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. "You call it a story, Candace," Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "You call it a narrative. But this is my life. This is the life of millions of people who wake up every day to a world that doesn't see them as equal. And when I stand here and tell you that it's still happening, you sit there and dismiss it like it's a figment of my imagination. It's not a story. It's a reality." Jasmine's words sliced through the room, and the audience seemed to hang on every syllable. "You want to pretend it's all calm, that there's no storm brewing. But there is a storm, Candace, and you can't deny that anymore. The truth is too loud to ignore, and as much as you try to shut it down, it's not going anywhere." The room was electric with tension now. The battle between them, more than just ideological, it was personal, raw, and undeniable. Candace Owens may have tried to undermine Jasmine's words, but Jasmine's voice was stronger than ever, her resolve unbreakable. And the storm Candace had tried to call a calm had already begun to take shape. The heated exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Candace Owens didn't just end in the room, it exploded into the digital world. The debate that had unfolded in front of the cameras sparked a firestorm on social media, a battleground where the lines between truth and denial blurred. The hashtags #Justice for Jasmine and #Reform now began to trend within minutes as people rallied behind Jasmine's call for change. Communities of color, civil rights organizations, and activists flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram with stories of their own struggles, testimonies of racial injustice, systemic bias, and the unyielding fight for equality. Jasmine had become the symbol of a movement, not just a debate. Her words had struck a chord, and now she was surrounded by a tidal wave of support, the stories pouring in from those who had lived the same harsh realities she had so passionately described. People from all corners of the country, mothers, fathers, teachers, and activists, shared their own experiences with discrimination. "I had to fight twice as hard just to get my promotion," one post read. Another echoed, "My brother was sentenced to 5 years for a crime others got probation for." The system isn't fair, and Jasmine said it all. Jasmine's voice, already powerful, was amplified by these voices, and the movement was growing. The wave of solidarity was undeniable. Her supporters were united by the same undeniable truth. The system was broken and it needed to be fixed. The calls for police reform, racial sensitivity training, and equal opportunities echoed through the streets of the digital world. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman now. She was the face of a movement that demanded change. But on the other side of the conversation, Candace Owens had not been quieted. Instead, her supporters took to social media with just as much fervor, defending her point of view. The hashtag #Pull Yourself Up was launched almost immediately, as her followers rallied to the banner of individual responsibility. The rhetoric was clear. It wasn't about systemic injustice, it was about personal accountability. The system isn't the problem. People are, one tweet read. Candace is right. The real issue is people not taking responsibility for themselves. The backlash was swift and loud. Many in Candace's camp argued that the problem wasn't racism, but a lack of initiative and personal effort. They claimed that America had made progress, and that those like Jasmine were simply perpetuating a narrative of victimhood. Candace herself joined the fray, her words cutting through the noise with the same fiery conviction she had displayed in the debate. "There's no systemic racism in America anymore," she tweeted. "We've made so much progress. The people who are still stuck in the past are the ones keeping this country divided. It's time to stop blaming the system and start taking responsibility." Her supporters, mostly conservative and libertarian voices, echoed her sentiments, pushing the narrative that America had long moved past its history of discrimination. They argued that the policies Jasmine called for were nothing more than a crutch, one that kept people dependent on a broken system instead of empowering them to succeed on their own. It was a familiar argument, one that had been used countless times to dismiss the very real concerns of marginalized communities. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't backing down. She had a voice now, a voice that had grown louder with every story shared, every truth spoken. She had become the voice for the voiceless, the symbol of a movement that refused to be silenced. And with every tweet, every post, every comment, the movement only gained strength. On the other hand, Candace's supporters had also amplified their voices, but they had failed to shake the foundation of Jasmine's message. The divide was becoming clearer, the battle lines more defined. Jasmine represented the fight for justice, the demand for equal treatment, while Candace represented a defense of the status quo, a refusal to see the inequalities that still plagued the system. The digital divide was growing wider. What had started as a debate between two women in a room had now become a nationwide conversation. And as the discussion spread, it became clear that this wasn't just about who was right. It was about the future of this country, about what kind of society America wanted to be. Would it be one that faced its ugly truths and worked to heal, or would it continue to bury them under layers of denial and complacency? The answer was still unfolding, but one thing was certain. Jasmine Crockett's voice was no longer just her own. It was the voice of millions, and they weren't going to be silenced. The tension in the room had reached its peak, both women standing their ground, their words like weapons in a battle of ideologies. Jasmine Crockett's argument had struck hard, and Candace Owens, despite her deflections, could feel the weight of the conversation shift in Jasmine's favor. The fight wasn't over, but the battlefield had changed. Jasmine wasn't going to let the momentum slip away. She knew the road to change wasn't easy, but she had the strength to push forward, and she wasn't going to back down now. Jasmine took a deep breath, her voice steady, but filled with an unshakable resolve. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Candace," she began, her words measured but powerful. "I'm not here pretending that reform is easy. We all know it's a long road, one full of obstacles and setbacks. But the truth is, we can't stop fighting for a more just and equitable society. We can't stop demanding that our lives matter, that we deserve to be treated fairly, and that the systems in place work for all of us, not just a select few." Her gaze hardened as she locked eyes with Candace. "You can try to deny it, Candace, but the fight for justice is real, and it's a fight that has been fought for generations. We are the heirs of those who marched, who bled, who gave everything just to have the chance at a life where we're not treated like second-class citizens. And you know what? I'm not going to stop fighting for that. Because change is hard, yes, but it's necessary. It's worth it." Jasmine's voice echoed through the room, a declaration of defiance and strength. It's not enough to sit back and hope for change to come. We have to demand it. We have to take it, piece by piece, until we've built a society where we all have a fair shot, no matter our race, our background, or our circumstances. The fight isn't over, and it won't end until the system changes for good. Candace Owens, her expression still firm, wasn't about to concede. She leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You keep talking about fairness, Jasmine, but what you're asking for is division. You're pushing this narrative that we need a system built for everyone except those who don't face these so-called injustices. I'm all for progress, but not when it's based on ideas that have no grounding in reality. I will continue to fight for a society that's united, not divided by baseless claims, a society that doesn't use race as an excuse to keep people trapped in a cycle of victimhood. Candace's voice was unwavering, filled with a sense of conviction that had carried her through every conversation, every debate. But this time there was a crack in her armor, fleeting moment of doubt that Jasmine could almost taste. Candace had always framed herself as a champion of personal responsibility, of an America that had moved beyond its racist past. But Jasmine knew better. She had seen the statistics, heard the stories, felt the sting of inequality every day. And she wasn't about to let Candace rewrite history. You want unity? Jasmine countered, her voice a mix of fury and resolve. Unity doesn't come from ignoring the problems that are right in front of us. Unity doesn't come from pretending that everything's fine, that we fixed the system when we haven't even come close. We don't need unity in the form of denial, Candace. We need unity in the form of truth, in the form of real tangible change. I'm not talking about division. I'm talking about building a society where all of us can thrive, not just a select few. You can't call that division. You can't call that baseless. Jasmine stood taller, the weight of her words pressing down on the room. She wasn't just making an argument. She was challenging the very foundation of Candace's beliefs. The fight for justice is not a fight against America. It's a fight to make America live up to its own ideals. It's a fight to make sure that the land of the free really is the land of the free for everyone. Candace, despite her composure, could feel the heat of Jasmine's words seeping into her resolve. The truth of Jasmine's call for change was undeniable. And for a brief moment, Candace's certainty faltered. But with a sharp inhale, she regained her stance, her eyes narrowing in defiance. I will continue to fight for a society that's not divided by these so-called injustices. I will fight for a country where we look at each other as individuals, not based on race, not based on these divisions you keep stoking. A country where the only thing that matters is what you make of yourself. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She stood there steady, unbroken, knowing that this fight was far from over. That's what we're fighting for, Candace, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. A country where who you are and where you come from don't determine your worth, where we don't have to prove ourselves at every turn, where we're not seen as less than, and no matter how hard you try to dismiss it, we're not going to stop fighting for that. The room held its breath. The battle between them wasn't just ideological anymore. It was personal, and Jasmine had just taken the first step toward a victory that would echo far beyond this debate. The debate had reached its peak, the room still buzzing with the energy of Jasmine's powerful words. She had made her case, and though the conversation had no clear resolution, it had exposed the undeniable truth. Systemic racism was real, and it was something America had yet to reckon with. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just debating ideas. She was fighting for a future where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right. Candace Owens, poised as ever, had done her best to dismiss the truth Jasmine laid out, but it was clear. Candace's arguments were built on a foundation of denial. Jasmine's voice, though calm, carried the weight of experience. The fight doesn't stop here, she declared, the room hanging on her every word. We will keep fighting because every day millions are still fighting for fairness, for equality, for justice. Jasmine's eyes never left Candace's, but there was no anger in them, only a quiet understanding. This isn't about winning one debate, she continued. It's about creating a world where Black lives truly matter, where the systems that oppress us no longer have a foothold. The truth hung in the air like a battle cry, a reminder that the fight for justice would continue long after the debate ended. Jasmine wasn't just a voice in the crowd. She was a force for change. And though there was no clear resolution, the spark for reform had been lit. The struggle for equality would carry on, fueled by voices like Jasmine's, undeterred and unbroken. And as the debate drew to a close, it was clear Jasmine Crockett had not only made her point, she had ignited a movement. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.